Welcome to First Baptist Church. You're listening to the preaching ministry of Pastor Sherman Burkhead. Please check us out on the internet at fbcboron.org. So Mrs. Wise, would you please read the text?
Galatians 2:15 and 16. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. Because by works of the law, no one will be justified.
All right. So these Galatian churches, soon after Paul had left the area to plant other churches, began to fall away and believe a false gospel that grace isn't enough. This was because there were Jewish men from Jerusalem who came to these churches and began to teach them that if a person was going to be saved, then they must become Jewish, because salvation was only for the Jews. They were teaching that grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone was not enough, that they must also keep the law. And this caught Paul by surprise, which he expressed in his letter. He was amazed at how quickly these churches had turned from the gospel of grace and embraced this false gospel. That's why Paul wrote his letter. He wrote this letter to tackle this issue head on, because they had embraced a very dangerous gospel. And Paul adamantly declared that if anyone, whether human or angel, were to preach such a gospel that's different than what he had preached, then they were accursed or damned. The idea that a person needs to be Jewish and keep the Jewish law, or follow some man-made traditions or some legalistic set of rules to be saved is just outright heresy. Grace plus works is by definition a false gospel. And those who teach such a gospel and those who believe such a gospel are not simply in error on a minor doctrinal issue, but rather they are in the very danger of the fire of hell. And so Paul, an apostle, he also declares that there's only one gospel, and it is the gospel that he preached to them. And the gospel he preached to them was given to him by Christ himself and not taught by the other apostles. He had been preaching this gospel for years before he had even met the other apostles. He even then shared this gospel with the apostles later on his second trip, as we saw, and they gave him the right hand of fellowship, demonstrating that what he taught was correct. They also accepted Titus as an uncircumcised Greek as a brother in Christ, again proving that becoming a Jew was not a requirement for a person to have salvation. In addition to all that, Paul talks about Peter visiting the church in Antioch, which, by the way, was a church in Galatia. And Peter had fellowship with Gentile believers. In fact, he ate with them, which is a sign of acceptance to them. If there was any way that a Jew was to really give their signature or their approval of someone else, was to sit down and have table fellowship with them. Eating with them was a sign that they were accepted. And so Paul accepted these Gentiles not as just people, but as brothers in Christ. And he, even as Paul said, was living like them. But then Peter began to pull back. One of the Jews who favored the old traditions of separation showed up. Peter didn't want to offend them, and so he began to separate himself from the Gentile believers. But then Paul openly confronted Peter and the other Jews over this hypocrisy, validating the truth that the gospel that he preached is one by grace. And so to this point, Paul has been doing three important things in his letter that set up everything else we're going to talk about. He has established his authority as an apostle, because unless the Galatians understand the fact that he has this authority, they're just not going to reject the false gospel they had learned. Number two, he has established the legitimacy of the gospel that he's preaching. Right? This is the real gospel from heaven. And number three, he has been systematically destroying the arguments of the Judaizers. First, by demonstrating that the leadership in Jerusalem was on his side. He made a very clear point that the actual leaders in Jerusalem, the people that were high profile, actually were on his side, and that these other Jews did not represent them. And secondly, he was doing so by driving home the truth of the gospel that the leadership was believing. In fact, we see this expressed in verses 15 through 16, which is really the point of this particular text. Paul says, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners." Now, this is actually important for us to kind of understand where he's coming from here. Because some people would say then what Paul is saying is that the Jews as a nation was without sin. That, that they were above all the rest of the nations with respect to their ability to not sin. This is simply just not true. You just look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament makes very plain that the Israel, was just as bad and even worse at times than the surrounding nations. Over and over again, the Bible exposes their sin. Others would say that Paul is looking down on the Gentiles as if like they're inferior to him, right? That he is being condescending, saying that they were just Gentile sinners. But understand, he's not being condescending, right? Paul is actually making a clear legal distinction between the two groups of people. You see, as natural-born Jews, born in the nation of Israel, they held a certain spiritual status with God. Why? Because they had been given the divine law of God, right? They had been given the temple with which they could have as close a fellowship with God as anybody could. They had the priesthood that was interceding for them. They were God's covenant people. They enjoyed a special relationship with God, not because they were good, just because by the grace of God, right? As Paul explains in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, what is the advantage that has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? And Paul says, much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Their privilege was the fact that God saw fit to give them the law. The Jews absolutely, through history, have a favored status with God, and there's nothing wrong with someone being proud of the fact that they are Jew. It's a privilege, right, by grace. Paul himself was a Jew, and he was proud of this heritage. In fact, in Romans chapter 11, he says, "For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin." Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, he says, "Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee." He was proud of his heritage, but he also understands that it accounts for nothing. So it was certainly a heritage to be proud of. Why? Because before Christ came, these Jews had a special relationship with God that the Gentiles simply did not have. It just didn't exist. They had been given the law, and the Gentiles did not have the law. They'd been given the temple, and they're able to be close to God. But the Gentiles, right, they couldn't get very close to God. In fact, the closest they could be was the court of the Gentiles. They had to stand outside, the furthest away from the temple itself than anybody else. The Gentiles before Christ were very clearly outsiders to the family and the covenant of God. This was expressed in the architecture of the temple itself. It was also expressed in the traditions of the Jews. Right? They were unclean sinners and were separated from God, and this separation was made visible by the way the Jews separated themselves and the Gentiles. It was a visible reminder before Christ came that the Gentiles were outsiders. Right? And what Paul is saying is we, and Peter, Paul and others, we're not outsiders, but rather we were part of God's covenant people. Right? We began as insiders, but for all the advantages this might have for us, this did nothing to save them. Right? Why? Well, as Paul says in verse 16, "Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ." Paul makes it clear. He makes a very clear, unambiguous statement about what brings a person, Jew or Gentile alike, to salvation. It is by faith in Christ, and that is it. It's not about being Jewish. It's about faith in Christ, regardless of who you are. And I want you to notice in this verse that Paul is actually covering the entire spectrum, both positively and negatively. Right? Negatively speaking, Paul says a person is not justified. right? He's not justified by what? The works of the law. Being Jewish and being circumcised and following all the rules and keeping all the festivals and fasting and doing all that the law required does not justify someone in the eyes of God. It cannot. In fact, in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, Paul says, "For by works of the law, no human will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." The law cannot make a person right with God, because the law is simply a mirror that shows us our true condition, which means being Jewish has nothing to do with being saved. Being Jewish should bring even a greater reminder that one needs grace. Being a Jew, they should have the clearest picture of all of where they stand by their own merits before God. Right? Now, on the positive side of the spectrum, Paul says a person is justified through faith in Christ. And that's the good news of the gospel right there. For Jews and Gentiles alike, a person is justified by faith in Christ alone. That's it. In fact, as we remember in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation." For who? Everyone who believes. And notice the order. Paul still has his priorities straight and says, for the Jew first. Why? Because they're the people that received the law. They have this favored status with God because they were the recipients of the oracles of God. They had the temple, right? For the Jews first, but also, not just them, but also the Greeks. For in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it's written, the righteous shall live by what? The law? No, faith. And even more clearly expressed in Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 8, it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not your own doing, it's the gift of God, not the result of works, including works of the law, so that no one may boast." Paul, in this one part of the verse, makes it clear that salvation is not about being Jewish at all. It's not about upholding the law. It's not about what you can do for God. As a Jew himself, he is declaring the good news that it is by faith in Christ, and that is it. And I want you to notice what he says here. He says, "Yet we know."
Kim, I just need a Kleenex. Sorry.
No, that's right. Notice he says, "Yet we know," right? That a person is justified by works of the law, not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ. He says that this is something we know. Now, when he says we, who's he saying we? Who's he talking about?
Everyone.
He's talking about Peter, James. Peter, Paul, and the other Jews from Jerusalem. They know this truth, right? The Jews know this truth. If they're really Christians, they know this truth. They know that salvation is by faith in Christ and not through the law. They know it as Jews. And understand the Greek word that's used here for know, it's pronounced eido, has a real great deal of force to it. Right? What this word means properly is to see with physical eyes. That's what it means, right? As it naturally bridges the metaphorical sense of perceiving or mentally seeing. It's akin to the expression of, "I see what you mean," right? "I see what you're saying." It's a seeing that becomes knowing and understanding. Or in other words, we know this because we've seen this. We know this because we've experienced this. We don't simply know this as an abstract, idea or a fact. We know it and trust in it. We depend upon it. We are confident in it. In fact, you could say that. We are confident. We know, as Jews, we know we're born into the covenant family of God, but we know that this Jewish stuff won't save us. Our traditions won't save us. Only our faith can save us. Right? And Paul is so adamant about this point. Right? You have to see the force of what he's trying to communicate here. He's so adamant about this one point. Notice that he repeats it. He says, "So we have believed in Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified." 3 times in this one verse, right? In this one sentence, Paul states emphatically, no one is justified by works of the law. 3 times he makes that clear. We all know that at this point in history, when an author would write something, if they repeated themselves, we know they're emphasizing what they're saying. If they repeated themselves multiple times, it's super important. Again, it's like the word holy, holy, holy. We understand what the force of that is. And Paul is repeating this emphatic statement 3 times. He's really trying to be absolutely clear, right? What Paul is saying is the works of the law, absolutely, without question, cannot save you. Right? And 3 times he references faith, by the way. In fact, let's look at this entire verse 16. And we didn't know a person is not justified by works of the law, right? But through faith in Christ. So we also have believed in Christ in order that to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. This verse right here, stand alone, is Paul standing on top of the table, shouting to the top of his lungs as clear as he possibly can you not understand? Can you not see? Right? You were saved only by faith. It is not by the works of the law. Right? He cannot be more clear than he is right here. And notice he says that we also have believed in Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ. Again, who's we? Paul, Peter, and other Jewish Christians. What Paul is saying is we Jews, just like you Gentiles, have believed in Jesus Christ. We believe just like you do. We believe the same thing you do. Right? Now, why do we believe in Jesus Christ? Right? Well, it says very plainly, in order to be justified by faith in Christ. Why? Because by the works of the law, no one will ever be justified. Paul is making it clear that the gospel that he preached to the Gentiles is the same gospel that the Jews absolutely need. And that the Jews, because they have the law, should understand more than anyone else this truth that the law cannot save, but instead point toward the fact that they need to be saved. And that salvation is only by faith in Christ. And so, looking back then at how Paul is building his argument, let's reflect on a couple of things. All right, first of all, there's only one gospel, and that gospel is the one that he taught them, which is justification comes only by faith in Christ. And this is not a man's gospel, it is the gospel from heaven. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that any other gospel is by definition a false gospel, and as such is a damnable heresy. And for Jews, to a Gentile to become Jewish, to teach such truth is a false gospel. Even Peter and the other leaders of the church accepted Gentiles as brothers in Christ, which is evident by the text. But even they, being Jews, know that they cannot be saved by being Jewish, but only by faith in Christ. And then in light of that, in essence, what he's saying, you Galatians are foolish to listen to such false teachers. He's building an airtight argument here. With that, though, for us, I think the application is very simple. Let us remember and live in this simple truth. We are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And all of that is for the glory of God alone. You've been listening to the preaching ministry of Pastor Sherman Burkhead, a production of First Baptist Church in Boron, California. Our website address is fbcboron.org. And would you please consider partnering with us financially as we work to share the hope and the gospel of Jesus Christ with our community and our world.